How's it going? I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I'm an organizational psychologist and best-selling author. This is episode 4 of the 10X is Easier Than 2X YouTube series, which I'm doing. 10X is Easier Than 2X is a book that Dan Sullivan and I authored together. This is the third book in a trilogy. The first book is Who Not How. Second book, The Gap and the Gain. And this is the third book. In this video, I'm going to explain to you a lot of the science and research behind why impossible goals, seemingly impossible goals, are actually easier and simpler and more strategic than possible goals. In other words, 10X goals are easier and simpler than 2X goals. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is the core model of the book, 10X is Easier Than 2X. And just to give it to you, if you've never seen this model before, and this is in chapter 1 of the book, I highly recommend you read this book, 10X is Easier Than 2X. So if you're going for 2X growth, if you have a 2X mindset, what that means is that you're operating from the past and the present, and you're letting where you're at in the present dictate who you are in the future. So if you're going to go for 2X growth, you're going for linear growth. You're going for doubling your income or doubling the amount of books sold or maybe doubling your amount of subscribers. You're just going for more of what you're already doing. So 2X is non-transformational. And the main point here with this model is that if you're going to go for 2X growth, you can actually keep 80% of yourself. This is based on the 80-20 principle or the Pareto principle that says that 80% of your results comes from 20% of what you do. So basically, if you're going to go for 2X growth, you can keep 80% of your existing self, your existing clients, your existing strategy, your existing mindsets, behaviors, beliefs. 2X is non-transformational. You only need to get a little bit better at what you're already doing to go for 2X what you're doing now. 10X is the opposite of 2X. This is a key point here. A lot of people talk about 10X, but they've never actually defined the opposite. And so because they've never defined the opposite, a lot of people actually who teach a 10X mindset are actually teaching a 2X mindset. 2X is about doing more. 10X is fundamentally about doing less, but better. 10X is about higher quality, less quantity in everything you do, especially everything you think about, because your attention span is the greatest bottleneck. And so if you're going for 10X, what that means is that you can only focus on the core 20% of what you're doing, and you actually make the 20% 10 times better. You get 10 times better at what you're doing, and you've got to eliminate the 80%. I'm going to use an example of my son, Caleb. My son, Caleb, is 15 years old. He's a tennis player here in Orlando. And Orlando happens to be the mecca, not the mecca, but a mecca of tennis. There's an enormous amount of tennis academies, tennis coaches, tennis programs. A lot of amazing tennis comes out of Orlando and obviously Florida generally. So I'm going to use my son, Caleb, as an example to explain why and how seemingly impossible goals are easier and simpler than possible goals. And a lot of my insights came from a guy named Dr. Alan Bernard. Dr. Alan Bernard is considered basically the most living expert on a theory called constraint theory. Constraint theory is a theory that came from a famous book called The Goal. The Goal is a famous book all about how every organization has a key goal, and that key goal determines the key bottleneck. The word bottleneck is really a key aspect of this theory. And I'm not going to go into the weeds too much, but the main idea here is this. Every goal has a bottleneck, and the bottleneck is the core constraint that you need to solve to achieve the goal. Now, the main problem here that most organizations have, and this is heavily explained in the book The Goal and also by Dr. Alan Bernard, is that most businesses, most organizations never actually put their attention on the bottleneck and solve the bottleneck instead. And I would say that the bottleneck is the 20%. If you focus on the 20% and solve it and make it better or transform it, then the goal will be solved. The problem is for most businesses that they're focused on the 80% of things that don't matter. These are the weeds. Most businesses, their attention and their resources are overly spread on stuff that doesn't matter. And that's true of human beings as well. Most human beings, their focus is not on the bottleneck, which is the 20% that's going to produce almost all of their results and success. Instead, most of us, our efforts and our energy and our attention is wasted on the 80% that doesn't really matter. So one of the core things that Dr. Alan Bernard has studied throughout his career is the idea of impossible goals. He's always asking, how can you make impossible goals possible? And I was in a meeting with Dr. Alan Bernard where we were asked to reflect on how we could improve our income or our revenue by 10%. 10%. And what Dr. Alan Bernard said to the group is, he said, this is a really bad question. He said, it's a bad question because there's seemingly impossible things you could do to grow your profits or your business or your income by 10%. If I wanted to grow my income by 10%, or if I want to grow my YouTube channel by 10%, or if I want to grow my book sales by 10%, there's literally infinite options. There's a lot of different things I could do to grow by 10% because 10% isn't very much. It's linear. And so there's a lot of things I could do to make marginal growth. He said a lot better question would be, how could you grow your revenue by 10 times? The reason that's a better question is because unlike 10%, where there's 1,000 different options that could get you to 10%, 10 times is so big that almost nothing will work. Almost nothing you're doing right now will get you to 10x growth. Almost everything you're doing right now is actually in the 80% that's a distraction from 10 times. That's actually what makes it useful, is if you make your goal 10 times bigger, or if you make it seemingly impossible, then you're now you're operating in a place that's not based on your past and not based on your current assumptions. And one of the things that Dr. Alan Bernard invites people to do is that he invites them to take their goal, whatever it is, and make it seemingly impossible. Call it 10x it, take it to the next quantum level. And again, on this video, I'm going to show you an example of my son and how he can apply this to his tennis, which is actually going to make his life and his success a lot easier. But basically, the idea is if you make your goal a lot higher and a lot bigger, because the goal is so high, almost nothing will work. As an example, almost nothing would work to sell 10 million books or to make $1 billion. Almost nothing you're doing right now would work. And so it forces you to ask, well, what would work? And this is what Dr. Alan Bernard invites people to do, is he says that would be impossible unless what? You ask what conditions would need to be true for this to become possible. And those conditions, those few potential pathways, psychologists have a concept called pathways thinking. And the idea of pathways thinking is that every goal has obviously multiple paths, but higher goals have fewer pathways to getting there. And so if you actually make the goal higher, because it has less pathways, that will actually make it more strategic. You'll actually be able to identify the few things that actually matter, and you'll also be able to identify the 80% of things that doesn't. Put simply, 80% of what you're doing right now isn't going to work at 10x. 80% of what you're doing right now is a distraction that if you actually get clear on your 10x goal or your 10x target or your 10x transformation, your next level seemingly impossible future, then you'll get rid of the 80% that's holding you back, and you'll be able to focus your energy on the bottleneck, which is the 20%. And what you do is you focus on this and you create 10 times better. 10 times higher quality is what leads to 10 times higher quantity. So let me show you an example of my son, Caleb. My son, Caleb, right here, just showing the screen. If you're listening to the video, then you won't be able to see this, but that's all right. You can hear me out. So my son, Caleb, wants to play college tennis. He's 15 years old. He plays for his high school team. He also is part of an amazing academy, does private lessons. And his coach recently asked him, Caleb, what is your goal for tennis? And Caleb basically said, my goal is to go to college. And so that's his goal. His goal is to go for college. And his coach then said, Caleb, why isn't your goal to go for pro? Why college? And Caleb said, I don't really know. And admittedly, that going pro is not his goal, but that was kind of what his coach invited him to ponder, is why not go for pro? So while me and Caleb were driving home, I asked him, I said, Caleb, what did you think about what your coach said? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, let's just talk about this for a second. I said, do you think your current path or your current trajectory would get you to the college level? And he said, I don't know. He said, I think so, but I don't know, maybe. And I said, what about the pro level? Do you think your current trajectory or your current path would get you to the pro level? And he immediately said, absolutely not even close. So even my son, Caleb, who's 15, knows that there are different paths and different trajectories to getting to different destinations. The goal is what shapes the process. In other words, it's kind of like an airplane. If you're leaving Los Angeles and you're flying to Florida, it's going to be a very different path going from LA to Florida than from LA to New York City. And going for pro level tennis is that different from college level tennis. They're not the same thing. They're not even the same game. It's kind of like being a blogger. Being a blogger versus being a professional author are two fundamentally different things. Being an average or an amateur author is very different from being a pro author. Being a college basketball player is different from being a pro basketball player. You know that this is true because a lot of people who are top of the game in college end up going to pro, and they can't make that transition because they're two fundamentally different games. They don't always translate one to the other. So back to Orlando, Florida. Here in Orlando, Florida, there are likely hundreds, possibly even thousands of potential pathways of getting Caleb from where he is now to college tennis. There's dozens and dozens of coaches, academies. He could play for high school. He could approach it a lot of different ways. And this is the point, that having lower goals, kind of like 10% better, there's a lot of different pathways to college. So there may be literally 100 or more, maybe even 1,000 coaches in Florida, and maybe even hundreds of coaches in Orlando that could get my son from where he's at to the college level. But to the pro level, there is not that many. There may be realistically only 10 or less, maybe even 5 or less realistic coaches, programs, and paths to get my son where he is now to getting him to the pro level. So what that means is that there's way less paths to the pro level than to the college level. That seems like it makes sense, but what the whole purpose of constraint theory and what Dr. Alan Bernard is trying to get people to think about is if you make the goal 10 times higher, so college to pro is like a 10x jump. If you make the goal 10 times higher, it then identifies the few pathways that are actually effective, that are actually useful. In the case of Caleb, if he actually made his goal to go for pro, then it would, and if we got serious about it, it would force us out of his current pathway. Again, the idea of psychology, and this is a huge aspect of hope and motivation, is that in order to have hope and motivation, you not only have to have a clear goal, but you have to have what they call pathways thinking, which is the idea that you're continuously changing and adjusting the pathway you're using to getting there. Insanity is the idea of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. When you're highly committed, you're flexible in the process, and so that means that you're going to continuously find and adopt new and better pathways of getting where you want to go. Well, higher goals have much less pathways, and so they force you out of most of what you're doing now, and they help you identify the few pathways that have the most efficacy or the most usefulness. And so if Caleb truly committed and made his goal to go pro, and we got serious about it, that would fundamentally change what we're going for. Back to the 80-20 principle, first off, we'd have to find a coach that could get him there. We'd have to find academies and programs that would get him there. But also the 20%, the idea of the 20%, the goal shapes the bottleneck. The bottleneck of going pro would be different from the bottleneck of going college. So this goes to the idea of deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is a well-worn topic in psychology. It's the idea of how you ultimately develop skills and expertise. But a key point of deliberate practice is that it's not about the accumulation of experience. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, falsely popularized the idea that it takes 10,000 hours to become an outlier. It's not 10,000 hours. It's not about the quantity of experience. We all do many things a lot and actually get worse at them, similar like driving, for example. Driving is something that people may do over decades and actually get worse at it. So it's not about 10,000 hours or the accumulation or the quantity of experience. It's about a specific quality of experience. Most importantly, it's about where that experience is directed. As human beings, whatever we focus on, we expand. There's a concept actually called fitness function. Fitness function, and I go into it pretty heavily in this book, but fitness function is the standard to which you're optimizing for. So we all are optimizing for a particular standard. And so in this case, if pro is the fitness function, if getting to pro level tennis is the fitness function, meaning the standard, that standard is going to shape a very different process for my son Caleb than the standard of going for college. And even within colleges, there's a lot of different types of colleges or a lot of different fitness functions or standards. He could go for example, D2 or D3 or Division I level tennis. He may want to go for a very specific college, and that would have a different standard than going for some other school. So you want to get very specific in the goal or standard because the goal is going to shape the process, and the process is the developmental path in what you become. So this is really important because the process of going from where my son is to pro is going to be very different from the process, literally the daily process, not only his coach, his training, but what he gets good at. The 20%, which is the actual bottleneck or the things that matter for going pro, are going to be different from the 20% of going for college. Going for college is going to actually develop in Caleb different skill sets, different abilities, even a different identity than going for pro. If he goes for pro, he's going to have to get good at a lot of things that he would never even have to think about if he was going for college. And so the goal determines the process, but the main point here is that higher goals have less paths, which actually make them easier to pursue. If my son went for pro, we would then have to get him the best coaches, and he would find out what's required. What he would have to reverse engineer at the pro level, what's that 20%, and that would lead him to a much more specific, much more powerful, much more effective deliberate practice or process than if he was going for college. So if he actually went for pro, the path would be a lot more direct. The path would be there'd be a lot less options of the path. He'd have to let go of his 80%. But also, it would become a lot easier for him to play at the college level if he truly went for pro. So this is one of the core reasons why seemingly impossible or 10x goals are easier than possible or 2x goals. Tim Ferriss actually talks a lot about this in his book, The 4-Hour Workweek. He says that unreasonable or unrealistic goals are easier than realistic goals. He talks about how getting $1 million of funding is actually easier than getting $100,000 of funding. He even makes the joke of getting the one perfect 10 in the bar, talking about like picking up a girl, is a lot easier than picking up the 5/8 in the bar. He talks about different reasons. I'm talking about strategy and pathways and like plausibility of the simplicity of the goal and of the process and the developmental process of deliberate practice. What Tim Ferriss talks about is excitement and motivation. So higher goals are inherently a lot more exciting. They have a lot higher why, but they're also a lot less competitive. And it's totally true. If you think about my son, for example, there are probably 10 or 100 times more college players going for college than for pro. And so if he made that the goal, and then if he started reverse engineering pathways, processes, and deliberate practice, coaches and stuff like that, he'd have way less competition. He would go down a path that is far less trodden. That's why, most people are going for average. If you make the goal a lot higher, there's a lot less competition, and there's a lot clearer pathways, and there's a lot more motivation. Also, it would lead you to much different mentors, leaders, and things like that. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. Fitness function is the idea that whatever you're optimizing for, that's going to shape who you are. But there's another crazy concept. This is the field of epigenetics. Epigenetics is the idea that our biology and our genes are not fixed, but certain genes turn on and off based on our environment and based on how we perceive that environment. It's not just the inputs that come in, but it's how you process those inputs. This is the difference between trauma and post-traumatic growth, is that you may view a certain thing as really negative, and that's going to ultimately impact your biology, whereas you may see something, the same thing, very like a trial or a negative experience, or maybe my son losing a match, he can view that as catastrophic, or he could view that as this is happening for me. And so how he chooses to process the experience, you have input, processing, output, and how you choose to process or filter or perceive the experience is ultimately what shapes your biology. So a key aspect of what they call epigenetics, or even just our biology, is the idea that our perception takes our experiences and it converts those experiences into our biology. So who you are now is the accumulation of how you've processed and filtered and framed your prior experiences, but also to the idea of the goal shapes the process. So if my son is going for pro, that's going to change what he's looking for. In psychology, there's a concept called selective attention, and it's the idea that you see what you're looking for. There's a great quote that says that too many people are so busy looking for the bronze coins that they miss all the gold coins all around them. So you see what you're looking for, and whatever you focus on, not only you create more of, but whatever you focus on, you become. And so if my son took his goal from college and he quote unquote 10x'd it to the pro level, that would change what he sees. First off, we would get different coaches and different things, but he would start to see things differently, and he would convert his experience into a different biology. In other words, his future self would be a different person with different skills, different knowledge. In 3 years from now, my son will be a different person if he goes for pro versus college. Whatever we choose to optimize for, whatever we choose to commit to, that takes us on a developmental path. That leads us to certain pathways, but it also leads us to perceiving our experiences a certain way. And we take those experiences and we literally process or convert them into our identity, our worldview, and our very biology. So as an example, if you're going for becoming an elite runner, right? That's versus becoming a bodybuilder. Those two different goals or fitness functions are going to lead you not only towards different paths, the goal shapes the process. Obviously, you're going to have a different process and different practices, different routines if you're going to go for runner versus if you're going to go for weightlifter, but also how you convert those experiences is going to shape you into a different person with a different identity, different worldview, and different biology. And so the goal shapes the process, but the goal also shapes who you become and it shapes what you see, but it also shapes how you take what you see, your perception, and how you filter your experiences into literally who you become. It's wild. 10x goals are easier than 2x goals. They're simpler, they're easier, they take you on a much simpler and more non-linear path, a more non-competitive path, and a more motivating, more simple, more powerful path. Impossible goals are easier than possible goals. They're funner, they're better for your brain, they're far more transformative, they're also non-linear. Going for 2x goals or going for small goals, it doesn't transform your brain very much because basically you're just taking where you are now and you're just doing a little bit more of it. You're tweaking a little, you're not tweaking a lot, which means you're not transforming your brain and your neural pathways at a high level. 10x goals are better for your brain. They're more exciting. They're more transformative. I hope you enjoyed this. That was episode 4. Talk to you soon.